as part of normal physiological processes involving sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation, having to increase and decrease cardiac output, these are the two things we need to worry about. This happens because of the structure of muscle tissue. This happens because of my ability to produce and secrete epinephrine. So I can regulate the force of contraction and stroke volume by these two mechanisms. Now I'll tell you that the more cardiovascularly fit a person is, the easier it is for your body to do these two things. So you can affect stroke volume more easily the more fit you are. The less fit we are, this is not our main mechanism. Our main mechanism would be by heart rate. But if we get fit, we can do this better. Now, what is this business about afterload, and why do we care about that? When you take a blood pressure on somebody, how many numbers do you get? 2. And we're going to do this in lab after we get back from break. We take 2 numbers. Essentially what you do is you take a blood pressure. So in between, if you put your finger, you can feel it moving around. If you put your finger underneath your biceps and in between your brachialis, you'll feel a couple things moving around in there. One of them is going to be a nerve, a brachial nerve, and you can actually feel it in your wrist as you start pushing on it. Okay? And the other thing rolling around is going to be a brachial artery. If you push real hard and collapse that brachial artery, you'll notice your hands start getting pretty white over time and whatever because you've just impeded the blood flow to your hand. Okay? That's what we do when we put that cuff on there. We blow that up and we collapse that. And we put a stethoscope right here and I listen. And guess what I hear? Nothing. Why? Because there's no blood moving. What you're listening for is blood moving through a vessel. And then you release the pressure and you start to hear it move. Every time the heart beats, it pushes a little bit through. That is the maximal force that is being generated in that vessel. So that is your systolic blood pressure. And then I keep listening. And eventually, as I keep letting off the pressure, I stop hearing it. And I stop hearing it because there's no more pulsing of blood, it's just a continual flow of blood because the pressure is equal in the cuff as it is in the blood vessel at rest. And that's your diastolic blood pressure. You with me on that? So systolic blood pressure, the number is the force generated by the heart to push the blood out. Diastolic blood pressure, now think of it this way, is the blood pressure keeping the semilunar valve closed. Okay? So what's a normal resting blood pressure? Somebody give me a number they think is reasonable.
120 over 70.
120 over 80, I'll take that, that's normal. What are these, millimeter mercury or torr or something like that, or units? 120 over 80 is a good resting blood pressure. Okay. The 120 is the force being generated by the ventricles during systole. The 80 is the resting blood pressure in the arteries during diastole, hence systolic and diastolic. So this is the force holding the semilunar valve closed. You know the aortic semilunar valve? We said that pressure has to be generated to push blood, to open that and push blood out the aorta. This is the pressure you got to overcome. So guess what? You get no ventricular ejection until ventricular pressure is greater than 80. And then you start pushing blood out. So the difference between these two, right, is something called pulse pressure. It's the pressure that generates your pulse. That makes sense? So you take your pulse out here, that's the pressure that generates it. So the pulse pressure is the systolic minus the diastolic, right there. So in this case, it would be 120 minus 80 millimeters of mercury, or about 40 millimeters of mercury. You okay with me on that so far? So that's the force that's generated. So we know this number changes, right? We just spent some time. Guess what epinephrine does to this number? It goes up, right? Guess what elastic recoil would ever do to this number? Goes up. Right? So that number, this pulse pressure, it is directly proportional to your stroke volume. The harder your heart beats with a given diastolic pressure, the more blood that's going to be pushed out. Now, does that make sense? That's kind of just again, be kind of logical. Now, if we are functioning optimally, right, if I'm functioning optimally, this is something my body regulates, and I'm going to keep at 120/80. And so this back pressure here, this diastolic blood pressure, is going to stay at about 80. I will mention this, and this is kind of entertaining, is that someone who's a really fit athlete, as soon as they start exercising, their diastolic blood pressure drops, their systolic blood pressure increases. So what happens to their pulse pressure? Goes way up, and their stroke volume goes way up. Me and you, when we start exercising, guess what happens? They both go up, right? So it stays relatively the same, so we can't really affect these that much. And in fact, if you're really not fit cardiovascularly, this is what happens. They both go up, but the diastolic one goes up faster than the systolic one, which makes that even worse, right? So we'll see what your problems are after Thanksgiving, right? Don't eat too much.